The After-Death Journal of an American Philosopher, The Worldview of William James, by Jane Roberts, introduction by Seth, read by Martin John. 13. Biological Faith and Nature's Source. Thursday morning, May 19, 1977. On Earth, I thought I devoted a good deal of attention to the nature of thoughts and concepts, and the connection between them and private and national life. Now I see that all of the Earth's natural events, its seasons, the varieties of manifestation and expression, all represent an inner, inexhaustible nature that is mental as opposed to physical, if we must use such terms. The given planet, with its astounding framework of creativity in which Earth's creatures reside, and which supplies them with all their needs and requirements, all of that represents but one facet of this larger nature's capabilities. This nature, initially mental, propels thoughts into actuality, regulates their development and growth, and provides to each being a given mental, psychic, and spiritual world which is, again, naturally expressed and seeks its own development. Here also the psychic requirements and needs are met, and a state of grace is safely provided in which action can be taken without care, and by this I mean without the anticipation of impediments. This brings us to faith, of course, which as I now perceive it as a physical, biological condition of growth and a psychic or spiritual condition as well. It is as if faith were the agent that developed a negative into a definite picture in the darkroom of the mind. And without faith, the events will not take. My life's work gave me such ideas, and Christianity's brighter beliefs stress faith, but unfortunately in such a shallow manner that often faith and intellect seem to be adversaries at best, or complete strangers fated never to meet to discover their common ground. Here, however, faith is so obvious and ever present, its principles so clear, that I am given a close-up view in which faith's importance and characteristics are definitely shown to be the agents in which any kind of growth can creatively happen. I am not referring to the brassy, almost harsh, false optimism that is on earth sometimes flaunted in faith's name, nor even of faith in this or that church or theory or school, but of a faith that exists whether or not it knows its object, whether or not it is attached. To the extent that faith applies to anything, then it is trust in one's natural order of being, the feeling that the conditions for existence are largely conducive to it, that needs will be met within the circumstances of that natural order, and that one is couched and supported in one's existence by some larger nature from which the natural order springs. In such a medium, bones, frogs, stars, and philosophers grow. I'm speaking of a pragmatic, psychic, or spiritual medium that must be present if any cell is to develop, if any atom is to combine with others. In other words, of a medium in which all events and actions happen. The expectation of motion is involved, whether it be physical or mental motion or both, and a freedom of direction in which action can occur. That is, faith is self-moving or promotes motion and dissolves barriers. The infant's blind faith operates faithful to an inner biological and spiritual vision, providing the necessary belief in safety to allow for the infant's accelerated growth, so that the child reaches out, explores, and is free enough to exercise its curiosity. For the development of curiosity is dependent upon just such blind biological faith, and curiosity is also one of creativity's underpinnings. Faith easily makes a legitimate biological claim, then. Its lack in any area results in a vacuum of development, a weakness in which, for example, faith's natural immunities break down or disappear. Faith's presence is an active health-promoting agent. In my present environment, again, like the summer day, faith everywhere surrounds me, so that its support is one of the most outstanding elements of my existence. There is a complete lack of threatening conditions of any kind. I would have imagined such a state to be lacking also in challenge and creativity. Instead, I am filled with a sense of wonder, curiosity, and impetus that is never tiring. So natural do I now find this faith that it is hard to believe it was not a conscious part of my mental constitution during life. To the contrary, as mentioned earlier, I was often struck by depression, and while attracted to faith, I was also concerned lest I become faith's fool, particularly since I found no element to which I could justifiably attach faith. And to me, regardless of my feelings, it seemed that faith must be in something. Democracy came closest to justifying my faith in that regard. It could rouse men to constructive action and best meld the private and public good. Science and religion in my time each vied for men's faith, but faith that is attached to any one element, be it church, government, or science, is always in jeopardy. For at one time or another the object of faith will no longer justify it, and faith itself will become lost. Or certain kinds of men can attach their faith, like their love, to a series of objects, one after the other, thus making faith continually operative, each time losing it and then finding it anew. In life, I was much interested in such issues, particularly where faith was concerned with belief systems, for it seemed to flourish equally well in the most auspicious and most inauspicious mental environments, and to grow as well around the silliest and the most profound of doctrines. Thursday afternoon, May 26, 1977. But what, I asked, stood in faith's way? And if faith did possess a biological value, then why was it so lacking in the majority of my fellows? More than this, faith's appearance was not always welcome and often came in quite abhorrent form. For how many people I met professed faith in the most nonsensical or dangerous of doctrines. How many faiths existed by virtue of their exclusions. For example, there were those whose faith denied either the soul or the body, pinning their beliefs on one or the other, but struck with such a smallness of mind that the tenets of their faith showed by contrast only the limited area of its scope. Thus, heaven was closed to non-Christians, and belief in Christ often brought membership in an exclusive spiritual club as snobbish as any Londoner's. Other frameworks, such as the Eastern ones, included a faith that excluded millions, the untouchables, or displayed a callousness towards life itself in which the purpose of life was to escape it or any repeat performance. So I found surcease again in my faith in science and democracy. But faith I now see is a more general, omnipresent quality that is best not attached to any particulars, while it may at any time include them in its larger scope. On the other hand, faith is personal, intimate, and must spring from the individual's innate knowledge of his connections with nature, following the order of existence into which he was born. Each person is born with that spiritual and biological optimism, that psychological aura of safety in which existence is meaningful precisely because each individual feels the presence of a personal universe in which he and every other consciousness has meaning, even though that meaning may not be intellectually understood. But where can faith's justification be found if it does not reside in the object of its attachment, or if the intellect alone cannot discern it? It can be discovered through the exercise of the intuitions and creative abilities, and through the natural inclinations and leanings of the individual. For I now know beyond all doubt that each person is gifted with natural faith and insight, with built-in impetus and guidance in which biological and spiritual faith are equally merged. Science, religion, and psychology have unfortunately, with the best of intentions, muddled that inner knowledge and separated man from the practical use of inner direction. Proof for the existence of the soul and its immortality cannot be found, as I once hoped it could be, by any assemblage of facts, but through direct knowing, direct experience, which can yield a comprehension of those psychic events, but in a different order of knowledge entirely. The proof is in the pudding, and such evidence would result in a far better world, of course. But more important, in the meantime, each man or woman who succeeds in rediscovering biological and spiritual faith receives evidence of that ancient heritage through a complete regeneration of body and mind. When that regeneration falls short of its mark, the comprehensions have not been allowed full sway. A cosmic consciousness, experience that denies the importance of desire, for example, is tarnished, rejecting the impulse that initially made it possible, for all creativity springs from desire. That fact is gloriously apparent to me, though spasmodically, when the intelligent light I mentioned earlier sometimes radiates with a depth of desire almost beyond imagining, as if desire is so intense it must break up into a million segments, each forming a life, a consciousness, a being. That desire and its showering segments are eternal. Of this in my own mind I am assured. To go along with one's desire, to ride the thrust of one's own life, does indeed lift an individual into communion with that far vaster desire and power, not to the annihilation of the individual desire, but to its activation at other levels of being. And there lies a paradox. For those who speak of the death of desire and the assimilation of the individual into the whole are often the most individualistic of people, the most frantically fueled, the most eccentric and one-sided. In many such cases their comprehensions, once begun, are side-tracked, it is true. But in its purest version, natural faith seeks the fulfillment of the most individual and original tendencies of a person and accelerates rather than diminishes his desire. Monday morning, May 30, 1977. Therefore, one man's vision need not look like another's, but each person, interpreting the nature of reality through his own experiences and characteristics, will reflect a different segment and shine with a unique cast, so that all of these visions taken together may suggest the larger picture of man's meaning by pointing out, even if in exaggerated form, a particular aspect that would otherwise go unnoticed. Therefore must each person trust his own nature, for in the same way it has a purpose, brilliantly focusing within the world a facet of being that within life's framework was meant to be. The infant takes its first steps in response to that innate biologically and spiritually rooted faith that instills confidence, responds to curiosity, and promotes motion. The child knows its faith is in its own capabilities and senses the properties and powers of its limbs, each of which possesses its own motivation toward motion. The legs want to stand, to run, to use themselves, and each cell within the body contains its own impetus and biological faith. Wednesday morning, June 1, 1977. I am surrounded now by that kind of faith, only here it seems to be applied in a different manner. That is, I feel like exercising my psychological parts as if the self that I've known is an infant in contrast to some sensed further development. I'm motivated to travel out along psychological paths rather than physical ones. Each, however, as strange to me as the front walk to the newly creeping infant. At the same time, I feel gently coaxed by the psychological medium itself. The intelligent light draws me outward spiritually in the same way that the summer landscape calls Earth's populace out for picnics, parades, or simple walks. My dreams and memories are now being put together in different ways than I once experienced them. They exist in my mind now like children's blocks in a playroom, which can be made to form more than just one castle, bridge, or village at a time. It is as if those blocks of memory can fit together not only one on top of the other, or sideways, but each can fit inside the other, and the sizes of the blocks themselves can change, growing or shrinking. So, I am encouraged to play with my own memories in such a fashion, being intrigued at the different patterns they form, but more, being astonished at the various meanings that can be quite legitimately read from any one block. That is something like a psychological alphabet in which images, words, and feelings undergo strange transformations, so that I understand that no memory is ever a finished thing, but an ever-changing and ever-creative element that actually alters the concept of past, present, and future time. But now some curiosity rouses within me, or rather now I am aware of it, that urges me toward psychological exploration, that stretches inner psychic muscles perhaps, and I am immersed in a kind of delightful security and assurance that such exploration is possible. I know, for example, that in one way or another the most simple of my memories can lead to an incredibly distant intersection point where it opens up to all of the other memories of man's racial future and past. I am more than aware of the necessity and futility of analogies. Yet it is as if I am traveling like a tadpole through my own psychological reality, swimming through the stream of my own memories, which are multicolored and glimmering, and at some point I will come to the open sea, about whose infinite area rise the psychological shorelines, the true inner landscapes, cliffs and mountains of time, memory and desire. By then, perhaps, I will have changed my form as the tadpole becomes the frog. But when I reach that open ocean, I will be equipped with whatever mental gills are required, and their true psychological mobility will allow me to transform into living tissue, in whatever terms, the product of my mind's vast creativity, a creativity innate in each of us, living or dead. Civilizations may rise up at my beckoning, for my own self once rose in that fashion. I feel, then, that man's heritage is this, that in ways presently far beyond my scope or possible attention, the physical world and all others are the powerful issue of our psychological reality, that we are immersed in this atmospheric presence or intelligent light, gently nudged and coaxed into further areas of growth, insight, and understanding, and that we travel through psychological worlds in which our experiences also automatically form other realities, one swirling through the other, each cooperatively interweaving with the others. All of this is based on love, but not as it can be anywhere defined. Each being is born through love, however, whether or not, say, a given child is born of unloving parents. The child's seed is formed, threaded, and the chromosomes intertwined by the same love that is characteristic of this knowing light. The love on earth may be often translated darkly, yet by its light only does reality come into existence. Thursday afternoon, June 2, 1977. Man's faith in science burned brightly in my time and is flickering in yours. Yet that faith began earlier and will linger later. As I knew it, that faith promoted action, zest, and curiosity. It was rousing, and under its auspices nations have banded together in constructive scientific pursuits. Democracy has utilized the banner of science's faith. Huge corporations like miniature nations produce goods undreamed of in past ages. Earth, sky, and oceans being explored in the light and through the thrusting drive of faith and science. Yet if it can rightly be said that religion took a stance of divorcing reason from faith, science divorced emotion from reason. And therein lay its greatest flaw. For techniques of investigation undertaken only by cold reason's light cannot be warmed by compassion or love, and the end will always justify the means. Fanaticism results. Scientists as overbalanced on reason's side as any priest on the side of intuitional faith alone. The scientist must repress his emotions and the priest his reason, at least in conventional institutional frameworks. Faith will then ultimately find no justification in either religion or science, for each will show its flaws. So often in my life I wore the tattered garments of a flawed faith. Thursday afternoon, June 23, 1977. I could nowhere within myself in life pretend that life's darker casts did not too often hold dominion, even though I had known others for whom those bleaker tints disappeared for all practical purposes in some vaster, more illuminated vision. I wondered what ailed my own temperament that life's tragic aspects appeared so monumentous and optimism often seemed at its best only a darker blindness. For if one is blinded by light, such a light indeed is a useless mockery. Therefore, a faith that closes down the magnificent fields of mental or intellectual vision, that blinds the faithful to all save one tenet, is equally treacherous. A faith that turns the follower into a fanatic is surely based upon the deepest doubts, for it must be protected at all cost. Such a faith provides an unwieldy, desperately manned craft, a sea amid the tumultuous waves of contrary beliefs, which must seem to cast dangerous undercurrents beneath each position of safety and everywhere threaten faith's survivors. Therefore I could not condone for myself a faith that denied reason or tolerance, even though such a faith often seemed practical enough for others at first or second glance. On examination, however, such a craft of concepts overflows with sloppy and inexhaustible power of unrecognized doubt, which ever rises in triumphant springs from an unconscious that senses too well the deep denied realities of feeling upon which faith's craft rides. Followers of such concepts must be forever bailing out, separating their beliefs from others, and looking out for the heretic in their midst. When, for example, I placed my faith in democracy as the end-all, the political savior of man's existence, when I extolled its virtues most, I was most alert against what I considered democracy's enemies, in terms of other societies or governments, or in terms of those anti-democratic tendencies that seem to militate against man's equality. It was when I put my faith in science that it seemed she almost betrayed me. For each unscientific attitude came as a threat to science. But more, it became a slur against my own good judgment. A man may make errors in choosing a mistress, but let him misplace his faith in the world of affairs, and he feels himself a fool. I make such a statement easily enough, but in so doing I resurrect old feelings and shake them out as one might an old garment. For such attitudes and emotions are no longer a part of my mental or spiritual attire. They are stored, however, in the spacious closet of my experience, intact. And while I recognize only too well their poor fit, lack of style, and outworn threads, still they were beloved habits of thought. I stroll among them now and then, picking one out for display purposes that once I would have worn as my normal garb. When I lived in time, I could recognize such ideas as the clothing of the mind when I saw others strutting about in the newest ideas or theories, sporting them like a woman her most stylish party gown, or a man his finest waistcoat. There were others who wore poverty of the mind with as much virtue as a monk might wear rags, carrying a mental sign, however, reading humility, but spelling superiority. Yet my own psychological habits remained invisible, nor did I realize that I donned my melancholy each morning as I did my coat, choosing its degree and quality as I did the color of my socks. It was my protection lest faith make a fool of me, lest in my search for the ecstatic in man I found it in myself and therefore could not speak about it with objective voice. For while I envied it and desired it in my fashion, I distrusted the disorderly garb in which it was often displayed. I admired the eccentric in man, sought after the uncommon, appreciated the bizarre, and understood the undying integrity of the individual. Yet to merge these ideas with democratic action and to view the masses of the people as separate manifestations of immortal souls, such was the goal I set myself. In your times, faith is even harder to come by than it was in mine. More than ever, many people find themselves entangled in webs of melancholy, seeing themselves relatively powerless, not as heroic victims of a capricious fate, but worse, as accidental outcasts of a universe accidentally formed, in which each creature is pitted against every other in a battle for survival that none can ultimately win. In such a mental atmosphere, how can faith be found or justified? In partial answer, at least, I'm editing my lengthy discourse with 3 essays in which a hypothetical individual moves from melancholy to faith. May that fictional motion turn to fact for my readers, and may that symbolic journey be transformed into a pragmatic faith practical enough to comprehend the facts of the soul and wise enough to see through the fictions that swirl through the passages of science and religion alike. End chapter 13. Thank you. Aloha.